Let me open with some sobering statistics. Since COVID, anxiety and depression symptoms have doubled roughly. They peaked during COVID and they've come down somewhat, but still roughly double from what pre-COVID times were. Affordability in Canada indexes show that the majority of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. Most of us have $200 or less, or are $200 or less away from not making ends meet from month to month. Surveys of people's trust in larger institutions across Canada show that across the board, people's trust of institutions is eroding. So whether that's government or media or education or healthcare or the church, our trust in larger institutions is eroding. And of course, if we watch the news, right, we're bombarded constantly with these crisis-type events that are on the news. Climate change, geopolitics, threats of war, tariffs, constant economic instability. Well, where am I leading with all of this? There's a word that's been coined recently by scholars. They call it polycrisis. Polycrisis. It's not just that there are these crises happening simultaneously, but that they are converging and they multiply upon each other so that the crises make the other crises even worse. So economic stress might drive mental health decline. Mental health decline drives social unrest. Social mistrust increases polarization. Mike talked about that last week. And then polarization makes it difficult to combat the social problems that we have. And then throw technology into the mix. It accelerates everything and complicates everything, right? So not just one crisis, and not just even simultaneous, but the convergence of crises which act upon each other and seem to multiply the crisis effect, what some scholars are calling polycrises. So where am I going with all of this? It's not just to make us sad and depressed. As we continue in this series, Faithful in Exile, we're addressing various issues in our world around us that impinge upon our faith and that impact us. I call today's sermon, Discerning the Times. Discerning the Times. And the issue I want to talk about today actually is not a single issue. It seems to be more like a convergence of different issues together. So what I mentioned, polycrisis, what we might be experiencing globally and as a society today. All these issues kind of embedded together, enmeshed together, entangled together with this kind of compounding effect, making things worse. What does our faith have to say to this? What does the Bible have to say to this? What does Jesus have to say to this moment in time in which we live? So that's what we're talking about today. Now, my text for today is Mark chapter 13. I'm going to talk about Mark 13 and biblical prophecy. And then we're going to talk a little bit about discerning the times and what that might mean in our context. And then finally, how do we respond? How do we respond in such a time? Now, as you've been following along, you'll probably appreciate that each of the topics that we've touched on in this series, we could spend a lot more time on, right? Every single issue, I think you'll have appreciated that there's a lot deeper we can go. And same thing with today. But the intention of this is just to orient our lives generally, that we are able to kind of think about these broader issues, that our faith that we have, that our faith does say something and does influence how we live within the society in which we are found, that it does change our outlook and our perspective, okay? So let's start with Mark 13. Now, one of the things that's really striking about the New Testament is that they were experiencing something of a polycrisis themselves in their own right at that time. The disciples were living under Roman occupation. All the Jewish people in the land of Palestine and Israel were living under Roman occupation. And although the empire itself was relatively stable, locally in Palestine, there was lots of political instability. There was economic exploitation going on, religious corruption going on. Religious revolutionary movements would rise up and then be stamped out constantly in this environment. And all that was very interconnected and unstable, destabilizing. And for the first century Jewish people, it felt too like something big is brewing on the horizon. In fact, Jesus speaks directly to that in this passage that we had read out. Now, we read out just the second half of that passage, of that larger passage. In the first half of this passage, Jesus is actually addressing a different issue, and we'll touch on that. He's talking about the temple. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. And then in the second part of the passage, which we read out, he's talking about this fig tree. From the fig tree, learn its lesson, he says. When the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So in Israel, in ancient Palestine, fig trees during winter, they shed their leaves and then they start to grow buds and leaves in the springtime. Much similar to Vancouver. If Jesus were around in Vancouver today, he might have said something like, when the cherry blossoms bloom, you know that spring is here and summer is coming. He's talking to the disciples about discerning the season in which they find themselves, the times in which they find themselves. So this is the second half of that passage. It's about this discernment. But the first half of the passage, as I just alluded to, was really about the destruction of the temple. Jesus refers to the destruction of the most holiest place in their mind on the planet for them. And then the disciples say, well, when are these things going to take place? I'm just going to read that from verse 2. Jesus said to one of his disciples, do you see these great buildings, referring to the temple and the other buildings around it? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So this is happening before the destruction of the temple in Jesus' time. Then the disciples asked Jesus, when will these things be? What's the sign? And then in that passage, which we did not read, Jesus talks about the destruction of Jerusalem that is coming. He talks about the temple being destroyed itself. He talks about wars, earthquakes, famines, widespread persecution, tribulation, and suffering, unlike anything that has happened in history up to that point. False messiahs everywhere. And all of these things actually happened. So in AD 66 AD, this is after Jesus has died, and this is in the beginnings of the church in the first century. 66 AD, the Jewish people revolt against Rome. 4 years later, 70 AD, Rome responds, descends upon Jerusalem, destroys it, destroys the temple, burns it. It's completely gone. It has not been restored to this day. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish people were slaughtered at that time. We don't know exactly. Ancient estimates say maybe 1 million people, but several hundred thousands at least. And then hundreds of thousands more starved to death, taken as prisoners, exiled from their homeland. So hundreds of thousands of Jewish people suffered in this time. The single most tragic event in all of Jewish history up to that point. Jesus was predicting and talking about this event which was about to happen in their generation, in their lifetime. It would come about. And he says, when you start to see signs of this destruction, it's going to happen. The temple is going to be destroyed. But then Jesus also starts to shift in this passage that we had read out. Something else is happening here too. Not just the destruction of the temple. In verse 24, he starts to say, "But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." And then we have our passage today. "From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender, puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near." Okay, so I just want to talk about this text for a little bit because it might not be clear to us what is actually going on. Is Jesus talking about the temple? Or is Jesus talking about something else that doesn't really have to do with history? Because it sounds like he's moved on to talking about something else that's cosmic in scope, beyond history. So which one is it? Well, the answer is yes, both. So this is how biblical prophecy works, not just with Jesus, but if you read the Old Testament prophets as well. You can think of biblical prophecy as kind of like layers, or history like layers. Do you remember, I'm dating myself, but these old overhead transparencies? For those who are probably less than 30, you probably don't even know what that is. It just looks like some kind of weird contraption to you. But in my day, this was technology, okay? And what we would do, we'd put these overhead transparencies, we can write on them, and you put it on top of the projector, and it projects this image through that lens and onto the wall behind you. And then you put one transparency on top of another and right on top of that. Or you can draw diagrams and transparency over transparency over transparency. And there's these different layers that you can kind of take off and put on, and you can show one diagram, but you can show different layers of that diagram or of that drawing. That's kind of like what biblical prophecy is like. When Jesus is describing what is going to happen, he's talking about what's going to happen in his day, in his generation, and he even says so. And then he's also talking about something else beyond that, greater than that, that's not just in that layer, but in another layer. And so it's almost as if he's looking at it from above and describing the whole thing. And some things pertain to his layer, his historical era, and some things pertain to other layers. So biblical prophecy is a little bit like that. These historical eras, you could think of them as layers of these transparencies. And they're interconnected historically with one another. But the bigger picture is often what the prophets are describing. These patterns is what Jesus is referring to. So the patterns of destruction, of rebellion, of chaos, these are the patterns that Jesus is describing that in the end will be reflected not just in history, but at the end of history, beyond history. So he is talking about his day, and we know that actually happened. He predicted these things before they happened. And then he's also talking about something beyond history, at the end of history. So this is kind of how biblical prophecy works. And he's teaching his disciples to recognize the patterns, like pattern recognition. Because when you see these things happening, it's a sign of what time you are living in. So be aware, stay awake, he says. And in their time, it was in particular about the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem and the turning of the ages at that time. Now, if this is true of biblical prophecy, Jesus' words are true not just for the first century, but also for every era, and also for us today, also for our era, our historical time. And so as we think about the world, I don't want to get into too many details. We will have opportunities to look at this in the future, in a future series, hopefully. But as we look at the world around us, are we just seeing what is going on historically? from a human perspective and the things that are going on mechanistically around us? Or do we see from a spiritual perspective? Are we discerning a spiritual vision of what is going on around us? So when we talk about polycrisis, what is going on? These multiple crises on multiple fronts, the world globally experiencing. What is going on? Can we live in such a way with wisdom and insight with our lives today in this context? Jesus also says something else. He says it's like birth pangs. Well, what happens in childbirth? A woman experiences labor, and there are these tremendously powerful contractions, right? They don't happen all the time, but there's periodic intervals, contractions, and each one's stronger than the next until the child finally is born. But you don't know exactly when that baby is going to be born, do you? You don't know when that last contraction is the final one. So I remember when Grace was pregnant with our first, Joshua, and I won't tell you the details, but when we went to the hospital, she found a hospital bed, and then labor started and began, and you know how long it took? 40 hours. 40 hours of labor later. So, yes, contractions began eventually. And then what happened was that you just don't know when it's going to actually happen, right? So this is what Jesus is saying. And I think it's like that in history as well. There are these kind of pushes towards what God is doing in the world. And there's these patterns that we can recognize in the world that have to do with chaos, destruction, opposition to God in the world. And we will be caught up in that. And he's saying to us, be aware, be awake, stay alert. Don't be ignorant of what's going on around you. See it with spiritual eyes. But at the same time, you don't know when that hour or when that day will be. You just don't know. Even Jesus doesn't know, he says, right? Only the Father knows. So, pattern recognition. What does Jesus want of us then in this time? As we start to discern the things that are going on around us, as we even think about the different historical layers that have happened since Jesus was here on this planet, well, there's one phrase that keeps coming up in our passage today. It's stay awake. Stay awake. That's a phrase. Verse 33, be on guard. Keep awake, he says. You do not know when the time will come. Verse 35, stay awake, for you do not know. You do not know when the master will come. And verse 37, what I say to you, I say to all. Stay awake. That's the admonition. That's what he wants us to do, to stay awake, to keep alert. 3 times he says that. He commands his disciples, stay awake, be alert. Don't fall asleep at your post. And then Jesus tells this parable of a master in charge of a household. He goes away on a journey and he asks the people to do their work, and he assigns a doorkeeper and he says, stay awake. Each servant has their work to do, and the doorkeeper's job is to stay alert, because you don't know when the master is coming back. Could be at midnight, could be early in the morning, could be right in the middle of the night. You just don't know. So what's Jesus' admonition to us? It's not to try to calculate the day and the time when he's going to come back. It's not to live in fear, but it's to be awake and alert. So this is a difference between being alert and being awake, and being anxious and being fearful. One is about being confident that the Lord is returning, and it's a posture above all, about how we live our lives. And the other is coming out of fear, reacting to the world in fear. So that's not what staying awake means. What staying awake means, I think, is mostly about a posture of our lives. It's as if Jesus had never left, as if the Master had never left. We live as if that Master had never left us, and so we live in the same way. There's another story in the Gospels around Jesus' death, Gethsemane. So the Gospel of Luke, he takes his disciples with him and he goes to pray. This is the night in which he's going to be crucified. And Jesus leaves his disciples at one place, right? And he goes off, maybe a stone's throw away from them, to pray because he knows what's about to happen to him. So that's the gravity of the situation. He wants to pray to the Father. And he tells the disciples, stay alert, stay awake. And he leaves them, he goes and prays, and he comes back. And what are they doing? They're sleeping, right? You know, on the most fateful, important night of his life, they're sleeping. I think Jesus knows that we have a tendency that when he steps away from us, or when we feel that he stepped away from us, we kind of get into this tendency to not be alert, not be awake, and not be vigilant. That seems to be part of what's going on. He's asking us to stay awake, even though it seems like he's not present. And so when he's absent, he wants us to behave and to be mindful, to have this posture in the same way that he's right there with us. So all that we're doing, whether it's our work, our relationships, our studies, our hobbies, do it as if Jesus is right there with you. And you have this mentality. He could come at any moment, any day. It could be at any moment. This could be the final push. That's the mentality, that's the posture, the attitude he wants us to take. Okay, I want to close just by bringing it back to our theme of exile, which we've been going through in this last couple of weeks or a couple of months. Being faithful in exile, because the two themes I feel are really very well interconnected. Exile, and then this sense of being awake, staying awake. Exile presupposes that not everything in life is going well, right? Culturally, spiritually, God's people were in exile. They were living in a foreign land under oppression, under oppressive circumstances. So not everything is going well. Same thing in 1 Peter with the New Testament church. They were experiencing some forms of suffering. Maybe not physical suffering yet at that time, but lots of psychological or emotional, spiritual suffering, we could call it. Lots of things that were going on for them. But exile presupposes something very, very, very strong. Exile is only for a time. It is not forever. It's just for a season. God has a purpose. That's what we've been talking about for exile. So same thing. When we're talking about exile, you might be experiencing some kind of exile in your life. We talked about spiritual exile, cultural exile, and also personal exile. There are places probably in your lives that you feel, where is God in this? You have questions, you have suffering, you have pain, and that just are not answered. And you feel the Lord is not answering and he's not close in those areas. The promise is that exile is only for a time. It's only temporary. Now, I don't know what that means temporally. If that means next year, next week, next month. Some of these prophets, they talked about exile and that God will return, and it didn't happen in their lifetime. So I don't know what that means temporally, but it means it's only temporary. God's purpose for exile in your life is not forever. And so no matter what it is that you're experiencing, do you have the perseverance to be faithful throughout that circumstance? I don't know what God's timing will be in your life. It may not be what you expect it to be or what you want it to be ideally. But the promise is that it's temporary. It's only for a time. It's only for a season. Isaiah 40 says this, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem." This is in the midst of their greatest, deepest exile in Babylon. "Cry to her, her warfare is ended. Her iniquity is pardoned. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." And then one of the greatest prophetic moments in the Old Testament, a voice cries, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain will be made low. Uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. All flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." And I was referring to who? Jesus, right? Jesus. He was going to be the end of exile for the Israelite people. So I just want to close now with a few questions for us all to reflect on. Are you asleep? Are we asleep in your life right now in some way? Maybe not physically asleep right now, hopefully. Are you asleep in some area of your life? Number 2, where do I have a tendency to fall asleep in my life? So we all have patterns in our lives, right? Whether it's anger or selfishness or lust or greed, where do we have a tendency to act as if the Lord is not near and we kind of will do things our own way? And then number 3, what would it look like to stay alert? What action can I take? What decision can I make? A concrete decision in your life that will mean that will change between staying alert and being asleep. Make a commitment to something so that when you have a tendency to fall asleep or you have a temptation to fall asleep, then you have that alarm waking you up, right? So what are the things that you can do? Let's pray together. Father, thank you for Jesus and for his words of exhortation and challenge to us. Thank you that he rose above history and had this vision for all of history, including during his own time. And thank you that he has this challenge for us to live in a way that's faithful to his return. We believe that he's coming back. So Lord, would you give us insight into how to live? So we want to lift up our hearts to you. Those places, Lord, that you know of. Help us to know what to do specifically. Give us concrete instructions ahead of time so that when we have a tendency to want to fall asleep, that we might rouse ourselves up and remember that it could be any moment, it could be any time that the Lord returns, and to live in such a way that is true for us. So Lord, you know our hearts, you know our lives, and would you give us strength and give us power to be obedient to you in all things. We pray this in Jesus' name.